He dropped the phone, not set it down, dropped it. I heard it hit the kitchen tile on the other end of the line, a sharp crack, and then nothing but the sound of my 8-year-old son standing next to me saying, "Mommy, what does liquidate mean?" My name is Nora Scott. And the man who dropped that phone was my father-in-law, Gerald Ockheffer, a man who had spent 8 years believing I would never be a problem. He was wrong. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone in one hand and my son Theo's small fingers in my other hand, and I was very, very calm. The kind of calm that takes years to build. The kind that doesn't come from peace, it comes from preparation. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. The Akafer family had money the way some families have weather. It was always there, always a factor, and nobody talked about where it actually came from. Gerald and his wife Vivienne had built a commercial real estate portfolio in Charlotte, North Carolina over roughly 30 years. Not massive, not flashy, but solid. The kind of portfolio that generates steady income and makes people feel permanently correct about every decision they have ever made. My husband, Daniel Ockheffer, is their only son. He is a good man. He is also, if I'm being honest, a man who spent the first 32 years of his life in the gravitational pull of two people who believed that proximity to them was a privilege. I met Daniel at a company retreat in the fall of 2015. He was warm and funny and completely unpretentious in a way I did not yet understand was partly rebellion against his parents. We were married in June of 2017 at a venue his mother selected, with a guest list she had input on and centerpieces she had approved. I didn't fight those battles. I was learning the terrain. Theo was born in March of 2018. From the moment he arrived, the Akaforce treated him like a continuation of their legacy, which, in their language, meant a continuation of their control. The college fund conversation started when Theo was only about 6 months old. Vivienne brought it up at a Sunday dinner in the way she brought up everything, as though the decision had already been made, and she was simply informing the room. She said that she and Gerald would manage a college account for Theo because, she explained, Daniel and I were still getting settled. She used air quotes around getting settled. I was 31 years old, employed full-time in financial consulting, and carrying the larger portion of our household expenses at that exact moment in time. Daniel was transitioning careers, but I was getting settled. I said, "That's very generous." And I meant it, actually. Because the contributions were real, Gerald and Vivienne put money into a 529 account in Theo's name, starting with $20,000 that first year, and they continued adding to it every year after that. They also accepted contributions from Daniel and from me, which we made consistently. By the time this story happens, when Theo is 8 years old, the balance had grown to $187,000. What I understood from the beginning, and what they either forgot or never genuinely registered, was that the account was in Theo's name, not theirs. The tax filings reflected that. Every deposit receipt carried his social security number. Vivienne was listed as a custodian, which is an administrative role. It does not mean ownership. It does not mean authority to liquidate, but we'll get to that. The first time I understood what I was really dealing with was Thanksgiving of 2019. Theo was about 18 months old, sleeping in a travel crib in the guest room, and the adults were finishing dessert when Vivienne said, in front of her sister and two family friends, that she hoped Daniel and I were thinking seriously about Theo's future. As though we were the type of people who hadn't thought about it. As though the question of our son's future was something she was nobly introducing to us. Daniel's aunt, a woman named Celestine who I genuinely liked, looked at me with an expression I recognized. She was waiting to see if I would react. I didn't. I passed the sweet potato pie to the person on my left and said, "We think about it every day." Which was true, I just didn't specify what I was thinking. What I was thinking, at that exact moment, was that 3 days earlier I had finalized a consulting contract worth $94,000 over 12 months, my largest single engagement to date. I had not mentioned it to the Akaforce. I had not mentioned it to Daniel yet either, because we were still working through the paperwork. But I had signed it. And the number Vivienne believed I was earning, some vague assumption she had constructed based on my job title and her own framework, was not even close. That was the first time I understood what they were afraid of. Not that I would fail, that I wouldn't. What I didn't know that Thanksgiving was that Vivienne had already begun telling Daniel's cousins that she and Gerald were really the ones making sure Theo had a future. Not maliciously, maybe, just casually. The way people claim credit for things they can see and ignore the things they can't. The second incident happened in the spring of 2021. Theo was 3, and I had started attending a small group pediatric developmental program at a clinic in our area, not because anything was wrong, but because I was thorough like that, and the program offered early language enrichment that I thought would benefit him. His pediatrician, Dr. Annika Larson, had recommended it, and we had been attending twice a month for about 6 months when Vivienne found out. Her response was to call Daniel separately, without including me in the conversation, and suggest that perhaps I was creating anxiety in Theo by seeking out programs he didn't need. She told Daniel that children who were handled too much developed dependency issues. She had no clinical basis for this. She had a feeling, and feelings in the Akafer family were presented as expertise. Daniel, to his credit, told her that the program was my call and he supported it fully. But the fact that she had gone to him first bypassed me entirely, as though I were a contractor whose contract was up for review, told me everything I needed to know about the architecture of power she was working with. I kept Theo in the program. Dr. Larson tracked his progress carefully, and by the time he entered kindergarten, his language development was in the 91st percentile for his age group. I did not share that data with Vivienne. That was the moment I stopped explaining myself to people who had decided in advance what I was. What I didn't understand yet was that Vivienne wasn't just dismissing my parenting. She was building a version of me for Gerald, for the cousins, for the family friends, in which I was a secondary figure in my own son's life. A placeholder. Someone the Akaforce were compensating for. The third incident is the one that made me make a phone call I had been considering for 2 years. It was a Saturday afternoon in August of 2022. Theo was 4. We were at Gerald and Vivienne's house for a family birthday, Gerald's younger brother turning 65, and there were about 30 people in the backyard. Vivienne's sister Celestine was there. A family friend named Byron Ape, who was an accountant, was there. And at some point in the afternoon, Gerald stood near the outdoor bar with Byron and, apparently forgetting, or not caring that I was within earshot, said the following. He said, "Nora's a smart girl. But she doesn't really understand how these things work long term. We're the safety net here. If anything happens, we're the ones who will actually be there for Theo." Byron said carefully, "The account is in the boy's name, though." Gerald said, "We set it up, we manage it, that's what matters." I was standing approximately 8 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking at a hydrangea bush. I did not turn around. I did not change the expression on my face. But I had filed away something precise. Gerald Ackafer believed that management was the same as ownership. He believed that because he had been the one to initiate the account, he had a permanent authority over it that superseded the legal structure of how a 529 account actually works. He was wrong, but he believed it completely. That Monday morning, I called an attorney named James Whitfield. No, let me fix that. An attorney named Solomon Adami, a family law and estate planning specialist whose office was 40 minutes from our house in the Dilworth neighborhood of Charlotte. I had found him through a referral from a colleague, and I had been sitting on his name in my phone for 22 months. I made the appointment for the following Thursday. I did not tell Daniel. Not because I was hiding it, I told him afterward, but because I needed to walk in there knowing exactly what I knew, without managing anyone else's reaction in the room while I was trying to listen. Solomon Adami was a quiet man with an extremely organized desk and the habit of repeating the last 3 words of what you said before he responded, as though he was double-checking that he had heard you correctly. I told him about the account. I told him about the conversation I had overheard. I told him about the dynamic. He repeated, "Believes he controls it." Then he explained, clearly and without any drama, that the account was Theo's. That the tax filings had consistently identified Theo as the beneficiary and Daniel, and me as the account owners, not Gerald, not Vivienne, despite their contributions. That Vivienne's custodial status was administrative only and could be modified. And that if Gerald or Vivienne ever attempted to liquidate or redirect the funds without authorization, that would not be a family dispute. That would be a crime. I drove home in a very calm state. I picked Theo up from his afternoon enrichment program. I made dinner. I told Daniel that evening that I had met with Solomon Adami and I explained what I had learned. Daniel was quiet for a long moment and then he said, "They wouldn't actually do that." And I said gently, "I know, but now we know what would happen if they did. I am telling you this because I need you to understand. When Solomon Adami gave me that information, I did not feel vindicated. I felt settled. Like a question I had been carrying for 2 years had finally been answered by someone qualified to answer it. What I built over the years following that consultation was not a secret, exactly. It was more that I never announced it, and nobody asked the right questions. My consulting practice had grown steadily since that first $94,000 contract in 2019. By 2023, I was bringing in somewhere between $240,000 and $270,000 annually, depending on the year, working with mid-sized companies on financial restructuring. I had two contractors who worked with me on larger engagements. I had a business account, a personal investment account that my financial advisor Renata Chukwu had been managing for 4 years, and I had been contributing to Theo's college fund from my own earnings consistently, not just accepting the Okaforce contributions, but adding to it myself. Renata Chukwu was the kind of advisor who texted you when something needed attention and did not sugarcoat numbers. She was the one who had told me, in January of 2023, that my retirement account was performing ahead of projection and that I should think about a conservative reallocation if I was planning any major purchases in the next 3 to 5 years. I was not, but I appreciated the precision. Daniel knew the general shape of things. He knew I was doing well. He did not know the specific figures, partly because we had always maintained separate accounts, a decision we had made early in our marriage that had served us well, and partly because Daniel had a relationship with money that was more philosophical than numerical. He understood it, but he didn't track it the way I did. The Akaforce knew almost nothing. Gerald, I think, had constructed a picture of my professional life based on job titles and visible markers, what neighborhood we lived in, what car I drove, whether we took lavish vacations, how often I seemed to be stressed about money. We lived in a nice house in a mid-range neighborhood. I drove a 5-year-old Volvo. We took 2 vacations a year, neither of them ostentatious. I did not seem stressed about money because I was not stressed about money. But to Gerald, I think my lack of stress read as Daniel's parents providing a safety net, not as competence. I did not correct him. The close call happened first at Daniel's cousin's housewarming in October of 2023. Theo was 5, running around with the other kids, and I was standing near the kitchen island talking to Gerald's brother's wife, a woman named Priscilla, when Gerald came over and asked, in that casual way he had that was never actually casual, whether I was still doing the consulting thing. I said yes, I was still doing the consulting thing. He nodded. Good money in that? Enough, I said. He tilted his head very slightly. He did that when he was about to say something that he considered generous. You know, Vivienne and I were talking. There might be an opportunity for you in the leasing office. One of our property managers is moving on. It's stable, benefits, you'd be good at the client-facing side of things. Priscilla was looking at the countertop. I smiled. I appreciate that, Gerald. I'll keep it in mind. And then I pivoted to asking Priscilla about her new kitchen tile, and the moment dissolved. That night, alone in our home office while Daniel was watching something in the living room, I went through the quarterly summary that Renata had sent me that afternoon. My investment portfolio had grown by a figure that was not small. The consulting practice was on track for its strongest year. I had understood something clearly, standing in that kitchen. Gerald did not offer me a job managing his leasing office out of cruelty. He offered it out of a genuine belief that it would be an upgrade for me. He thought he was doing me a favor. And that complete inversion of the actual situation, was more clarifying than any hostile act he had ever committed. It told me exactly how far the gap was between what he believed and what was true. And it told me that, when the gap finally became visible, the shock was going to be severe. What I couldn't have anticipated was that he wouldn't wait for it to become visible naturally. He was going to force it himself. The second close call happened in February of 2024, about 9 months before the Sunday phone call. Vivienne had called to check on Theo. She did this regularly, and I always appreciated it, whatever else I thought of her. And somewhere in the conversation, she mentioned that she and Gerald had been reviewing the account and thinking about moving some of the funds into a different vehicle. I said very calmly, "What account?" She said, "Theo's college account, of course." I said, "What are you considering moving it to?" There was a pause, then, "Oh, nothing firm. Gerald just mentioned it might be worth looking at some alternatives." I said, "I'd want to be part of that conversation before anything moved, just so we're all aligned." I kept my voice entirely pleasant. Vivienne said, "Of course, of course." The way people say of course when they mean the opposite. I ended the call, sat at my desk for about 90 seconds, and then picked up my phone and sent a text to Solomon Ademi. I did not call him in a panic. I texted him, "Can we schedule a call this week? There may be movement on the account situation we discussed." He responded within 3 hours. We spoke that Friday. Solomon confirmed that any liquidation or transfer of funds from Theo's 529 account that was not authorized by Daniel and me, the account owners on record, would be an unauthorized transaction. He used the word unauthorized very deliberately. And he walked me through what documentation I should have ready, what state filings I should pull copies of, and what the process would look like if we needed to move quickly. I pulled every document he identified that weekend. Every deposit receipt, every contribution statement, every state tax filing going back 8 years. I organized them in a folder on my laptop and printed a physical copy that I kept in a locked file drawer in my home office. That was the moment I realized that the gap between what they believed they had authority to do and what they actually had authority to do was not abstract anymore. It was potential. It was a direction they were considering. I had less time than I had thought. And if you're still with me, stay, because what happened next is the reason I am telling you this story. The phone rang on a Sunday in November of 2024 at 2:47 in the afternoon. I remember the time because I had just put a pot of soup on the stove and I was watching the timer. And when Theo came into the kitchen with the phone held out to me, his face had an expression I had never seen on him before, a kind of careful blankness. The way children look when something has happened that they don't have the vocabulary for yet. "It's Grandpa Gerald," he said. "He wants to talk to you, but he was talking to me first." I took the phone. "Hey, Gerald. Nora." His voice was different than usual, faster. There was something underneath it that I clocked immediately as resolve, the tone of a person who has talked themselves into something and crossed to the other side of doubt. "I've been meaning to call. We've made a decision about Theo's account." I kept my voice level. "What kind of decision?" "We're liquidating it. We need to address a family situation, and the funds are going to be redirected. We've already been in contact with the account administrator." He stopped there, and I could hear him waiting for me to react. When I didn't, he kept going. "We're doing what's necessary. You and Daniel will understand once things settle." I said, very quietly, "Gerald, can you hold one moment?" I covered the phone with my hand and looked at Theo, who was standing at the kitchen counter watching me with his serious brown eyes. "Buddy," I said, "can you go watch your show for a little bit? I need to talk to Grandpa Gerald." Theo looked at the phone in my hand. "Is he in trouble?" 8 years old, and somehow he already sensed it. "Everything's fine," I told him. "Go on." He went. I waited until I heard the television in the living room, and then I uncovered the phone. "Gerald," I said, "I need you to listen to me carefully. Whatever you've done or think you're doing, stop. Right now, do not take any further action on that account." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Nora, this is a family matter. The account was set up by our family. It is in Theo's name," I said. "The tax filings for 8 years show my son as the beneficiary and Daniel and me as the account owners. Your name is on record as a contributor. That is it." A pause. Then more firmly, "We initiated it. We've managed it. Managing it and owning it are not the same thing. Please get an attorney before you go any further, Gerald, because what you're describing is an unauthorized transaction. I want you to understand what that means legally before this goes another step." His voice shifted, the resolve cracking at the edges. "I think you're confused about how this—" "I'm not confused," I said. "I've never been confused about this. I need you to stop whatever you've put in motion with the administrator and call me back after you've spoken to an attorney." He said tightly, "We'll discuss this as a family." "Yes," I said, "we will." I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen for approximately 30 seconds. The soup was simmering. The television murmured from the living room. I picked up my phone, went to my contacts, and called Solomon Adami's office number. It went to voicemail because it was a Sunday, but I left a detailed message. I told him what Gerald had said. I told him about the administrator contact. I told him I needed him first thing Monday. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. He was at his brother-in-law's watching a game. I told him what had happened with complete accuracy, no softening, no framing. When I finished, there was a silence on his end that lasted long enough for someone in the background to shout at the television. "He actually said they were liquidating it," Daniel said finally. "Yes. How much?" $187,000. As of the last statement, another silence. "Then, I'll be home in 20 minutes. Daniel arrived in 17. He was still in his jacket, his face carrying the look of a man who has driven home deciding how to feel about something and has not yet landed. He sat at the kitchen table and I sat across from him and I walked him through everything again more slowly. The call, Gerald's exact phrasing. My response. The message to Solomon. Daniel's jaw tightened when I got to the part about the administrator contact. He actually already called them. That's what he said. He put his elbows on the table. "Nora, they can't do this. I know. Solomon is going to confirm it formally tomorrow morning, but I know. The question is whether Gerald does something irreversible between now and then. I'll call him. Let Solomon call him. That is a very different conversation." Daniel looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way he did when he was deferring to my judgment on something he knew I had thought about longer than he had. "Okay," he said. "We do it your way." Solomon called me at 8:15 Monday morning. He had already pulled the account documentation I had sent him months before, and he had made a preliminary call to the account administrator's legal department. He was very calm, the way he always was. They didn't complete it, he told me. Gerald made an inquiry Friday afternoon and indicated he wanted to begin a withdrawal process. The administrator put a hold because the request was inconsistent with the account ownership records. Standard protocol. He paused. He doesn't have authority to liquidate. The hold will remain unless you and Daniel authorize a release. The relief moved through me quickly and then was gone, because Gerald had tried. He had called the administrator. He had represented himself as having authority he did not have. That was not a misunderstanding. That was something else. What are my options? I said. Solomon laid them out. We could let it rest, remove his informal custodial access, and close the matter administratively. Or, given that Gerald had made a potentially fraudulent representation to the account administrator, we could pursue it formally. He did not tell me which to do. He explained both, the way he always did, and then he waited. I thought about Theo standing in the kitchen with that expression on his face, that careful blankness. I want to remove their access completely, I said. All of it, every level of administrative access. I want it done this week. That can be done by Wednesday. And I want to send a formal written notice from your office addressed to both of them, spelling out exactly what the account structure is and what the legal implications of any further unauthorized contact with the administrator would be. Solomon repeated, further unauthorized contact. Yes, I said. I want them to understand that what Gerald did Friday was not a trial run. I want that clear. I'll have the letter drafted by tomorrow morning. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I went to my home office, unlocked the file drawer, and pulled out the physical folder I had assembled, every deposit receipt, every contribution record, every state tax filing going back to 2018. I sat at my desk and went through each one, not because I needed to verify anything, but because I wanted to feel the weight of it. 8 years of documentation. 8 years of this being exactly what it was. Then I called Renata Chukwu. I need to set up a separate account structure for Theo's education funds, I told her. I want it completely independent. New account, new administrator, no external contributors. Renata's voice was brisk and unrattled. Smart, I'll send you 3 options by end of day. Thank you. That was mini payoff 3, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. That was just me doing what I had prepared for. But the thing about a plan that has been building for 2 years is that, when you finally execute it, it doesn't feel dramatic. It feels like finishing a sentence you started a long time ago. What I did not know, standing in my office with that folder in my hands, was that Gerald had already told Vivienne's sister, Celestine, what he had tried to do. And Celestine, who understood money, and who had spent enough years watching the Okafors to have a clear picture of their patterns, had called Daniel's cousin Adiz. And by Thursday of that week, there was a family dinner being organized, framed as a routine gathering, but with a guest list that included Gerald, Vivienne, Celestine, Adiz, and Daniel's Aunt Miriam, who was 81 years old and who had more moral authority in that family than any court document I could produce. The dinner was at Gerald and Vivienne's house the following Saturday evening. I was invited. Or rather, Vivienne called and told me it would be nice to see us, which in the Akafor family's language meant I was expected to attend, and it would be noticed if I didn't. Daniel asked me twice if I wanted to go. I told him yes both times, because Solomon's letter had been sent and received, because the account access had been removed on Wednesday, because I had a specific folder in my bag, and a phone with Solomon Adami's number at the top of my recent calls. And because I had been waiting a very long time to finish this sentence. Gerald and Vivienne's house was a large colonial in a part of Charlotte that had been expensive for 30 years and would be expensive for 30 more. I had been in that house dozens of times. I knew which floorboards creaked, which kitchen light had a slow starter, where Gerald kept the good bourbon for company versus the adequate bourbon for family. We arrived at 6:15. Vivienne opened the door in a burgundy wrap dress, her silver earrings catching the light, and she hugged me warmly in the way she always did, fully, with both arms, as though there had never been a phone call, as though her husband had not tried to drain our son's education savings 9 days earlier. I hugged her back equally warmly. We had been doing this version of warmth for 7 years. We were both very good at it. The living room already held Celestine, who was pouring wine near the sideboard, and Adiz, Gerald's cousin, who stood up when we came in and embraced Daniel with the ease of people who genuinely liked each other. Aunt Miriam was in the wingback chair nearest the fireplace, a blanket across her knees, holding a cup of tea with both hands. She nodded at me when I came in and I crossed the room to squeeze her hand. You look well, she told me. I feel well, I said, and I meant it. Gerald came in from the kitchen a few minutes later. He shook Daniel's hand, gave Theo a brief hug, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who has rehearsed several openings and cannot remember which one he chose. He settled on, Nora, good to see you. You too, Gerald, I said. Theo, mercifully, was absorbed into the back of the house by Adi's teenage daughter Zara, who had apparently agreed to watch him for the evening. I had specifically arranged this with Adiz beforehand, in a text message that simply said, "Could Zara keep Theo company in the back?" Adiz had texted back, of course. She hadn't asked why. I thought she probably knew. Dinner was lamb and roasted vegetables and fresh bread that Vivienne had made herself. She was a genuinely excellent cook, always had been. We sat around the long dining table, 8 adults, and for the first 40 minutes the conversation was the surface version of itself. Zara's college applications. Adiz's kitchen renovation. Miriam's opinion on the neighborhood's new development project, which was nuanced and ultimately unfavorable. I ate and talked and watched. Gerald was at the head of the table, as always, and he was performing a version of himself that was slightly too smooth, the gracious patriarch, the one who handled things, the one who always knew. He was doing it for an audience. I could see the seams. Celestine, across the table, had said almost nothing. She was watching Gerald the way I was watching Gerald, though from a different angle and with a different history. Her wine glass had barely moved. It was Vivienne who opened it. I had wondered which of them would. She waited until the plates were being cleared, the room loose with food and wine and the specific comfort of a long family dinner, and then she folded her hands on the table and looked at Daniel. "We should talk," she said, "about the misunderstanding from last week." Daniel set his water glass down. "It wasn't a misunderstanding, Mom." A small pause. Gerald's chin lifted slightly. "We were trying to address a situation," Vivienne continued, still looking at Daniel. "The property on Fairfield has had some maintenance issues. We needed liquidity quickly. We felt that." Gerald's hand came down on the table, not loudly but with finality. "We built that account," he said. "We started it, 8 years of contributions. We have an interest in how those funds are used." "You have a history of contributing to it," I said. My voice was entirely pleasant. "That's different." Gerald's gaze shifted to me. There was a flicker there, not quite anger, more like the expression of someone recalibrating whether they had underestimated something. "Nora," he said my name the way he sometimes did, as a gentle correction. "This is a family conversation." "I am family," I said, "and so is Theo, which is the whole point." Celestine picked up her wine glass. Miriam, near the fire, had stopped pretending to be elsewhere. Gerald leaned back in his chair. "The account was set up under our guidance. We are listed as administrators, custodians," I said. "One custodian, Vivienne, which is an administrative designation. It means she was authorized to make contributions and review statements. It does not mean ownership. It does not mean withdrawal authority." I reached down to the bag beside my chair and placed the folder on the table. I didn't open it yet. I just placed it there and let it sit. Gerald looked at the folder. His eyes stayed on it for 2 full seconds before he looked back up. "You brought paperwork to a family dinner." "I brought documentation," I said, "because I want to make sure we're all working with the same facts." Adiz, at the corner of the table, had gone completely still. She had the look of a person watching something that they have been privately expecting and are not going to interfere with. "This is unnecessary," Vivienne said. Her voice was strained at the edges, the composure just slightly too effortful. "We're not adversaries here." "I completely agree." I opened the folder. "This is the original account opening documentation from 2018. Theo is listed as the beneficiary. Daniel and I are listed as the account owners." I placed it face up in the middle of the table. "I have the same documentation for every year since, all 8 years." Gerald said flatly. "We know how the account is structured." "You know," I said, "that when you called the account administrator 2 Fridays ago and represented yourself as having withdrawal authority, that was not accurate." The room shifted, not loudly. The way a room shifts when something real enters it. Vivienne's hand went to the stem of her wine glass, then stopped. She did not pick it up. Gerald's expression did something I had not seen it do before. The surface composure, the patrician patience, cracked in a line across his face from his eyes down. He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked at Daniel. "This is between family, Daniel?" Daniel's voice, when he spoke, was quiet and very steady. "Dad, Nora is my wife, Theo is our son. This is entirely between family." Celestine set her glass down. "Gerald." She said his name once, with the weight of a woman who had been watching her brother-in-law for 30 years and had made peace with what she was watching. "Let the girl speak." Gerald turned to look at his sister-in-law. His expression was a landscape I had never seen on his face, a man recognizing that he has less cover than he thought. He looked at Celestine for a long moment. She met his gaze without blinking. He looked back at me. I took the second document from the folder. "This is a copy of the formal notice sent to both of you on Tuesday by Solomon Adami, my family law and estate attorney. It outlines the account ownership structure, confirms that your custodial access was removed on Wednesday of this week, and states that any further unauthorized contact with the account administrator will be treated as potential financial fraud and referred accordingly. Vivienne made a sound that was not quite a word. Her hand came up and pressed flat against her sternum, the way people do when something has physically moved through them. Gerald said, "You removed our access." "Yes." Without discussing it, I discussed it with my attorney and my husband. Those are the relevant parties. I kept my voice level. "Gerald, you called the administrator and tried to begin a withdrawal process on an account you don't own. You didn't call me first. You didn't call Daniel first. You didn't call anyone. You just did it." I paused. "So yes, I removed your access." He looked at the document on the table the way a person looks at something they cannot pick up because picking it up would mean acknowledging it exists. Adiz spoke from the corner, quietly. "He called me afterward, you know." He was looking at Gerald. "He told me there had been a miscommunication with the account people, that's what he called it." She looked at me. "That's not what this sounds like." Gerald's voice, when he found it, was lower. The confidence was still there, but it had moved from the front of his voice to somewhere behind it, propped up rather than natural. "We have put significant money into that account. Significant, over 8 years, we have a stake." "You have a history," I said again, more gently this time. "You contributed, that is generous, and Theo will benefit from it. But contribution is not ownership. Gerald, I need you to really hear me when I say this. You cannot take money from your 8-year-old grandson's education account because you have a property that needs maintenance. You cannot do that legally. You cannot do that morally. And you could not do it practically because the account is structured to prevent exactly this." Miriam spoke from her chair by the fire. She had not moved, had not put down her tea. Her voice was the voice of a woman who had earned the right to say the plainest possible thing. "Gerald, what on earth were you thinking?" The question landed the way simple questions sometimes do, with more weight than any complex argument. Gerald looked at his aunt. His mouth opened, and what came out was not words exactly. It was the beginning of words that dissolved. He pressed his lips together. Vivienne said quietly to no one in particular, "We were scared." Her voice was stripped of its usual architecture, no performance, no management. "The Fairfield property needs a new roof and the foundation work, and we didn't want to touch the mortgage line, and Gerald thought," she stopped. Her throat worked. "He thought we could borrow it and pay it back before anyone needed to know." Borrow it. I heard Daniel draw a slow breath beside me. I looked at Vivienne. She was not looking at me. She was looking at her hands on the table, and she looked, for the first time in all the years I had known her, like a woman who was embarrassed. Not defensive, embarrassed. I thought about what to say. I thought about Theo in the kitchen with that careful blankness on his face, holding the phone out to me. I thought about 8 years of Sunday dinners and condescending job offers, and being counted out and watching them construct a version of me made of their own limitations. And then I thought they were scared about money. That's it. That's the whole thing, not malice fear. The kind that makes people do things that are wrong and tell themselves a story about why it's right. It didn't excuse it, but it explained the shape of it. I said carefully, "There is no version of this where borrowing from Theo's account without authorization was going to be okay, whether you paid it back or not, because it wasn't yours to take." I looked at Gerald. "And what you did with the administrator, calling them and misrepresenting your authority, that is a problem with legal dimensions that I'm not willing to let go of completely. Solomon is monitoring it. If there is any further contact, any further attempt to access that account or any account in Theo's name, we will be treating it as what it legally is." I let that sit for a moment. "But if this stops here, if you acknowledge what happened and we deal with the property issue separately, through the family, through conversation, then we don't have to go further." Gerald looked at the table. He looked at it for a long time. His hand came up and he pressed 2 fingers to his forehead, and for a moment he looked his age, not the patriarch, just a man in his late 60s who was very tired and had made a bad decision from a place of fear and dressed it up as authority. Then he looked up at me. "I was wrong," he said. The words were quiet and unadorned, and I believe he meant them. I don't think Gerald Ackaffer had said those 3 words in that order very many times in his life. I watched them cost him something, and I did not enjoy watching it, which surprised me a little. "I know," I said. Celestine reached over and covered Vivienne's hand with hers. Vivienne did not cry, but her face held the specific shape of someone who is deciding not to. Adiz looked at me from across the table with an expression I recognized, the look of a person who had been waiting for something to be said out loud, for a long time, and had just heard it. Miriam, from her chair, finished her tea. Solomon sent a follow-up letter 2 weeks later confirming that no further contact had been made with the account administrator and that the matter had been resolved administratively. The formal record showed a custodial access modification on Wednesday, November 13th of 2024. It showed no completed transactions. The $187,000 had not moved. Vivienne called me the week after the dinner. She didn't bring up the account directly. She asked about Theo, whether he was still doing the enrichment program, whether his reading had picked up the way I'd been hoping. I told her yes. He was doing well. She said she was glad. And then we talked for about 12 minutes about nothing consequential. And when we hung up, I stayed at my desk for a moment and thought that there were some things that were not fixable and some things that were, and that distinguishing between the two was the work of a lifetime. Gerald and I had a more direct conversation in December. He came to our house, just him, without Vivienne, which told me he had thought about how to do it carefully. He sat at our kitchen table and he told me that he had spent 40 years believing that managing things and owning things were the same, and that he understood now they were not. He said it plainly. I gave him coffee and I thanked him for coming. Daniel was there. Nobody cried. It was, in its way, one of the more adult conversations I have had. The Fairfield property's roof was repaired in January through a combination of an insurance claim that Gerald's property manager, a sharp woman named Dolores Espinoza, who I had met once at a company event and immediately respected, had been pushing for months, and a short-term loan against one of Gerald's other properties. The solution had always been available. It had just required someone to be frightened enough to reach for the wrong thing first. Theo is 9 now. He is thriving. Dr. Larson described his development at his last checkup as, and I am paraphrasing here because it's not the kind of thing you forget, exactly where we'd hoped to see him. He does not know the full story. He knows that the account is safe because I told him so in plain terms an 8-year-old could process. That money is yours. It's for school when you're big. We keep it safe. He said, like in a lock? I said, exactly like in a lock. He went back to his drawing. Renata Chukwu has the account in a completely separate structure now. No external administrators, no informal custodians. Growth projections, if they hold, put the balance somewhere between $240,000 and $260,000 by the time Theo is ready for college. He will have options. That was always the only point. I still go to Sunday dinners at the Ackaffer house. Gerald still sits at the head of the table. He is somewhat quieter than he used to be, around me specifically, not cold, just measured. Like a man who has recalibrated where the edge is and stays a little further from it now. Vivienne still cooks beautifully. Celestine still watches everything from her corner of the room. Miriam, when I see her, squeezes my hand. I don't know that I've forgiven Gerald entirely, that's not a box I check on a calendar, but I also don't carry it the way I thought I might. He was afraid and he did something wrong and he acknowledged it. That's more than a lot of people manage. What I know is this: I built something, I documented it. I prepared for a moment I hoped would never come, and when it came, I was ready. Not because I'm fearless, because I did the work while I was scared. Every receipt, every filing, every quiet Sunday afternoon organizing paperwork instead of letting it sit. That's where it actually happened, not at the dinner table. So, did I go too far by removing their access completely and sending the formal letter, or would you have done exactly the same thing? Tell me in the comments.